Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here, welcoming you to an exciting edition of Fighting Game Thursday. Over the course of years on this channel, we have looked at the history of many different fighting games and franchises, and today is no exception. While the best-selling fighters of the early 90s were the likes of Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat, by the end of the decade other video games had become the king of fighters. In this new era for fighting games, Namco had become an absolute force to be reckoned with the Tekken series providing some of the most popular fighters on the Sony PlayStation and in the arcades alike. The tail end of the 90s would see the release of the world's most powerful game console yet, in the form of the ridiculously technically impressive Sega Dreamcast. The Sega Dreamcast would be the only console on the market at the time that Capcom deemed powerful enough to be able to receive adequate conversions of their hardware-demanding Street Fighter III arcade games. Titles that were developed to run on Capcom's fancy System 3 arcade boards. Despite the fact that these 2D sprite-based games contained more animation frames than any Street Fighter games previously, not many consumers opted to buy this title. However, that did not mean that the Dreamcast audience didn't have a penchant for fighters. While the average gamer passed on Street Fighter III, a fighting game that could be found in a majority of Dreamcast owners' collections was instead Soul Calibur, the most beautiful and realistic looking polygonal fighter that had by that point ever been experienced in a living room. In this special upload, we are going to take a trip down memory lane and look at why the general public and critics alike adored this game so much, functioning as one of the most important entries in the Dreamcast's whole library. But equally as importantly, why Street Fighter III failed in comparison to this all-time great. So without further ado, this, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of Soul Calibur, the Street Fighter III killer. Yeah! The mid to late 90s may be the biggest paradigm-shifting gaming that the world has ever witnessed. Games that had been previously 2D sprite-based affairs, such as the Super Mario and The Legend of Zelda, had been completely reimagined and repurposed to function in a bold new polygonal-based gaming world. The fighting game genre itself would actually begin to transition even before these Nintendo heavy hitters, with Sega's Virtua Fighter leading the charge as early as October of 1993. Co-creator of this video game, Seiichi Ishii, would soon land a new job working for arcade developer Namco, where he would take what he had learned while creating Virtua Fighter to create the first ever Tekken game in 1994. By 1996, there was an entire trilogy of Tekken games, with each entry being more visually stunning for the time than the next, with the PlayStation conversions of the games becoming some of the most iconic amongst the hardware's now legendary library of games. While games of this style were clearly in demand, Capcom on the other hand did not feel they had the resources to do their established Street Fighter franchise justice in the realm of 3D gaming, so would opt to keep the Capcom produced Street Fighter games in 2D, thus meaning that the likes of the Alpha series and later the Street Fighter III games would retain sprite-based art styles and gameplay. In the arcades in 1995 and on the Sony PlayStation in 1996, Namco would release another hit polygonal fighting game known as Soul Edge, or Soul Blade if you're a European like myself. The weapons-based fighting game that retained some of the feel of the Tekken series became instantly beloved. A polygonal weapons-based fighter had never been optimised to this degree previously, with the likes of Battle Arena Toshinden suffering from poor reaction times and poor camera angles. What made Soul Edge all the more authentic feeling was the fact that the animations for the game were created using motion capture based techniques, using passive optical system markers. This had never been performed in gaming previously, so no wonder Soul Edge featured such realistic intuitive movement. Fighters could even sidestep into the foreground or background, further taking advantage of the polygonal based look of the title. As ridiculously as impressive as this game was though, the game's sequel that we shall be focusing on today was of an even higher standard. Arriving 3 years after Soul Edge, Soul Calibur would see release on July 30th, 1998 and would appear in arcades running off of Namco's Advanced System 12 arcade hardware. The following year would see this title ported to the powerful Sega Dreamcast, with the home version of the game even receiving new features and graphical improvements. To say that Soul Calibur's release was met with applause would be a complete understatement, as gamers and critics alike went absolutely bonkers for this game. Not only would Soul Calibur manage to scoop up multiple Game of the Year awards, but to this very day it still remains as the 4th highest ever rated video game on Metacritic, with an insanely high rating of 98%. Bloody wow. This title was led by Hiroki Yotoriyama at the development helm, who rather than jump in on making a Soul Edge sequel straight away, he along with Namco would take a little time to stop and evaluate what made Soul Edge so popular in the first place. In the world of fighting games, this was the polar opposite approach of what the likes of Capcom, Midway and SNK had always done. Companies that had churned out sequels and reiterations of their fighting games with no breathing space in between releases. For example, most of us had lost count of how many Street Fighter, Mortal Kombat or Fatal Fury games existed at this point. To separate the new game further from what had come before it, the series' new direction would even land the franchise being rechristened as Soul Calibur, a portmanteau of the word Soul, as in Soul Edge, and King Arthur's sword Excalibur, ultimately the name that would be used within the game's universe for the holy weapon which would counteract Soul Edge's evil. While on the surface there is a huge graphical difference between what can be found with Soul Edge on the Sony PlayStation and Soul Calibur on the Sega Dreamcast, surprisingly the biggest difference between the two games is a massive change in mechanics. Soul Calibur's gameplay would be built around an internal Namco prototype which featured characters able to run openly in a field, a play feature we now refer to as the 8-way run system. The 8-way run system was introduced to the Soul series as a result of a lot of experimentation that had been implemented by the Soul team, with even them being surprised how this Namco prototype gameplay meshed with their established fighting game system so well. The 8-way run system and Soul games went together like fish and chips, Yorkshire pudding and gravy, or pie mash with jellied eels and green liquor. Basically, it was a match made in heaven. Work would be underway to build an entire fighting game around the 8-way run system, with a somewhat of a dream team being formed between the Souls developers and those who had worked on Tekken prior. The Namco Super Team would share a number of ideas and research with one another, with Yotoriyama himself stating he felt that with their cooperation and partnership, they were successfully able to develop the single greatest weapon-based fighting action game that the world has ever seen. To excuse the very silly pun, the 8-way run system really was a game changer, as all previous 3D fighters only had allowed for limited movement along the third axis, with sidesteps and rolls being sometimes present to allow for useful yet unsustained lateral movement. In Soul Calibur, on the other hand, players have the luxury of simply holding down a joystick direction, which causes the fighter to move in that direction, giving gamers a sense of freedom and deepening the strategy of the game. Another sweeping change from what had featured within Soul Edge previously was that Soul Calibur does not feature strict buffering requirements. What I mean by this is that the games from the likes of Tekken and Virtua Fighter needed expert timing at points to pull off certain combinations of moves. Soul Calibur, on the other hand, would introduce a more forgiving buffering system, making Soul Calibur one of the most accessible fighting games that had ever been created. The franchise's blocking system was also overhauled, allowing players to push back or redirect attacks past themselves, as well as swatting away at opponents' weapons to stun them. In regards to this game's weapon-based combat, Yotoriyama has described the game's concept as expressing fun and diversity in weapon combat, citing the contrast in how one weapon would affect gameplay compared to another and how they would react to each other upon clashing. Fighters differ in the game, with each of them being designed in a way that revolves around their weapon of choice. Each character in Soul Calibur was designed around the idea that they could be viewed as a real person could, and to this end motion creator Masataka Ishiguro emphasised the arm and leg movements for each character in relation to their weapon, wanting players to feel the individual motions and the realism within the game. The game, that serves as one of the most critically successful ever made, was produced by a team consisting of roughly 60 different people, with the team being scaled back to around 40 to produce the famous Dreamcast conversion. The celebrated Dreamcast port of the game was produced over the course of 7 months, with instructions for the game to be ready for the Sega Dreamcast North American launch. You know, the unforgettable date of 9999. Reportedly, this was easier said than done, with the team facing difficulties converting the game to run on different hardware. But the skilled team were highly successful in their endeavour, with Yotoriyama feeling that the team was obsessed with giving their best effort for the port. Early on in the video I mentioned that the Dreamcast version of the game featured graphical improvements, with one of the most noticeable of these changes applying to the stage's far backgrounds. The original arcade version featured flat, 2-dimensional images, whereas the Dreamcast conversion features 3D polygonal graphics as the far backdrop. Additional content was also added to the game to ensure replay value, based on research in other fighting games marketed at the time. Soul Calibur, like many fighting games, features a basic plot that pushes the action along, but more importantly a memorable lineup of characters. At first it was planned for Soul Calibur to be so dramatically overhauled from Soul Edge that the majority of the established roster would be replaced. However, 9 out of the 11 characters from Soul Edge ended up being carried over, with an additional 10 new characters joining the ranks. Ready for the Sega Dreamcast North American launch, a case could be made that Soul Calibur was the greatest conversion of an arcade fighting game that the world had ever seen, as the title was one of the first ever examples of a home conversion of a game being graphically superior to the arcade version. Soul Calibur did the Dreamcast justice in showing off that it really was the home console that had well and truly caught up with the arcades, with the game serving as a stunning sight to behold. Not only was all the features of the arcade here, along with the swanky new background graphics, but there was also new costumes and an extra character in the form of Cervantes de Leon. Most impressively though was the range of new gameplay modes, including a team battle, a survival and training mode, and the game also presented Mission Battle, whereby players completed various missions to attain points, which can be used to buy various art, which then unlocks extra features, costumes and stages. Other extra features include an artwork section and quirky additions such as a liquid metal version of the characters' costumes and much more. This in turn gives players additional reasons to keep playing this amazing game. IGN would give the game a score of 10 out of 10, deeming it to be a masterpiece, and in the process declaring it the most enjoyable fighting game on the planet, and also the #1 reason to buy a Dreamcast. GameSpot would also give the game a 10 out of 10 score. GameSpot would write, "This is truly a flawless game. In years past, Namco has built a bulletproof reputation for delivering arcade-perfect conversions of their already excellent arcade games into your home, with a gaggle of consumer-exclusive features that made you want to cry out in happiness. In the case of Soul Calibur, Sega should be crying tears of joy. Namco have amply displayed exactly how conversions of this nature should be done. This time, however, the house that Pac-Man built has done even better. Soul Calibur has reached US shores virtually unscathed, keeping it the game that will show the world how powerful the Dreamcast really is, kicking out an unprecedented number of special effects at an unsaleable 60 frames per second, all in mega high resolution with supercharged gameplay, nailing it all down. The game is on a completely different visual level than anything else out there. While it may seem bandwagon-esque to say this game is worthy of a perfect score, it really isn't much of a stretch to say it is. Yes, it is a fighting game, a genre with a fairly limited scope, but in so far as fighting games go, Soul Calibur is mind-numbing perfection. Namco has taken the best and made it considerably better. The level at which the company has done so is practically unprecedented. Think state of the art, absolutely brilliant in all aspects. As far as games of this type go, Soul Calibur is the undisputed king of the hill. It is essential in any gamer's collection. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, is some major levels of praise, with reviews across the board showering this game with all sorts of love. Soul Calibur for the Sega Dreamcast was exactly the sort of video game experience that the mass market of gamers out there at home were craving in 1999. So with the success of Soul Calibur, it is not surprising at all that the game would soon spawn many sequels, with the brand quickly becoming one of the most recognisable in fighting games. Now we have identified what it was about this game that impressed consumers so much at the end of the millennium, I guess before we close it is important to talk about why titles like this were the right way to go over the period, while franchises like Street Fighter seem to be on their last legs. I mentioned near the start of the video how Capcom opted to keep Street Fighter in 2D in spite of the extreme popularity that polygonal fighters were gaining. The original Street Fighter 3 game had been released as early as February 1997 in Japan, but there was no consoles on the market capable of doing the game justice until the release of a Dreamcast, with the game arriving on the hardware in Japan in December of 1999, 2.5 years after its arcade release. Now we have discussed at length in the past why the Street Fighter 3 games never sold very well in the 90s. 2D graphics are out of style, the Dreamcast didn't sell great, Capcom had released too many Street Fighter games for most of us to keep up with, and the gameplay featured a level of complexity that would largely alienate the mass market. Essentially, Soul Calibur was everything that Street Fighter 3 wasn't, which is why the average gamer flocked to the legendary Namco title, as opposed to the now cult classic from Capcom. IGN in their review demonstrates some of the apathy towards Street Fighter 3, which contrasts so starkly with that of their reception to Soul Calibur. Street Fighter 3 may have featured arguably the most impressive sprite work that had ever been seen, but that did not stop IGN from writing stuff about the Capcom game such as, "People aren't going to be playing this game for graphics, that's for sure. Some of us have gotten tired of all the craziness of other Capcom fighters. If you've tried out Alpha 3 though, or want to take a stab at some little known Capcom newbie fighters, or you'd like to pretend for a moment that the games industry was as baggage free as it was back in 1992, then this is your game." GameSpot would point out how tired gamers have become with Capcom releasing so many Street Fighter games, with them pointing out, calling Street Fighter 3 the third game in the Street Fighter series is just plain silly. Let's face it, between all of the Alpha games, all of the Versus games, and all of the upgrades to Street Fighter 2, we've seen more games in the past decade bear the name Street Fighter than we've probably needed to see. GamePro would summarise that with regards to the game, that hardcore fans are going to be on automatic and get it right away, but it's a tough situation for the average fighting fan. Basically, what GamePro were alluding to is how the whole of Street Fighter 3 seems to have been developed mostly around those who already have a deep understanding of fighting games, with Soul Calibur on the other hand being programmed in a way that makes the title a little more accessible to everyone. On the Capcom front, the Sega Dreamcast's Marvel vs. Capcom 2 game proved a lot more popular than Street Fighter 3, which proved there was still interest in sprite-based gaming. However, it is of note that the gameplay in that one was less complex, and the gimmick of a giant roster of Marvel and Capcom fighters seemed to be a lot more tantalising than just new Street Fighter games. The lack of success Street Fighter 3 would experience would see the Street Fighter brand almost put on ice, as the Soul Calibur franchise went from strength to strength. In fact, internals at Capcom stated through this time frame that they were not sure if there would ever be a new chronologically numbered Street Fighter game made ever again, as the brand seemed completely burnt out. Games like Soul Calibur, Tekken Tag on the PlayStation 2 were the more popular fighting games of the era, and made 2D fighters like Street Fighter look like a dinosaur in comparison. To put things into perspective, Street Fighter 3 diehards often put the Dreamcast's lack of success as partly responsible for Street Fighter 3's lack of support. But when you compare Soul Calibur sales with every Street Fighter 3 iteration, it quickly becomes clear that the Dreamcast was not to blame. All Street Fighter 3 iterations on the hardware only managed to shift an embarrassing 80,000 copies, whereas over 1 million people opted to buy Soul Calibur. Things didn't improve for the Street Fighter brand past the Dreamcast either, with the Rika Street Fighter EX3 also only shifting 85,000 units, despite being on the hugely popular PlayStation 2. Soul Calibur 2, which saw release during a similar time frame, would shift over 2 million copies. Essentially, by the dawn of the millennium, Soul Calibur games had become over 20 times more popular than Street Fighter titles, so it is no wonder that after EX3, the series would not see any new installments for quite some time. The likes of Soul Calibur and Tekken were the new faces of fighting games, and had successfully contributed to killing off 2D games like Street Fighter 3. But was any of this at all surprising when we consider how innovative, intuitive, and visually stunning that Soul Calibur on the Dreamcast was? Toriyama and his team truly were responsible for something rather special, and it is no wonder that Soul Calibur got one of the best critical responses to a game that has ever been documented, which certainly cannot be said for Street Fighter 3 at the time. So I guess, ladies and gentlemen, that just about rounds up the story of Soul Calibur and its killing of Street Fighter 3. If you enjoyed this video, let me know what you thought in the comment section down below, and if you would like to see me produce something on Soul Calibur 2 down the line. If you enjoyed this video, I have covered the history of plenty of other fighting games in the past on here, including Soul Edge, so why not check that one out in a moment. Videos like this are in part possible due to the awesome people who back what I do over on Patreon. Speaking of the best people in the world, special shoutouts go out to The Murder of Crows, Carl Johnson, Heo Paulo Lopez, Sebastian Velez, Nostalgia Collector, Ben Harradine, Koryama Senior, Ron Dinch, Evan Border, Philip Manth, Azul Rakai, Joaquin Varela, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Ian Boyle, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Jolly Holly, August Piazza, Justin Wang, Capcom vs SNK, Hermes Gonzalez, Man Shovel, Michael Hall, saying he enormous stits, Langston Miller, Noob, Sarah Powell, Lemic Renee, Marvin Araliga, TOG Driver, Louis Fiant, John Bates, David Barr, Chris Fisk, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Synth Spaces, Punk Toast, and everybody else who backs my work on Patreon. In the words of Elvis Presley, thank you very much.